Welcome to the Sober Sofa. My name is Shanti Patty Owen. I am your host for this channel, where we discuss all topics related to addiction and recovery. When I was quite young, I had a bruise on my face. And I remember looking at it in the mirror and being so happy that I could actually show my dad. I am a sex addict, love addict, an alcoholic, a compulsive gambler, and a debtor. Now, if you have subscribed to my channel already, you will have noticed that there's a slight name change to this channel, and that is due completely to your suggestions. Formerly known as the Sober Sex Sofa, we are now the Sober Sofa because many people have sent me privately emails, or they've called me if they're friends of mine, and said they love the content and they love the topics surrounding sex, especially sex addiction. However, they have trouble forwarding the videos to friends because many people get really triggered by the word sex. I have heard you and I have made the changes, and I think it is a very good change. So thank you very much. And if you want to send any more emails to me regarding any matters, send it to sobersofa@gmail.com. Thank you so much for returning. And if you're new, welcome. First of all, I want to give a shout out to the YouTube gods, whoever they may be who created YouTube. Never in our history has anybody had such access to the greatest minds in the world: scientists, psychiatrists, healers, doctors, you name it. If you have an issue, you can research it and you can find amazing support systems on YouTube. So anyway, YouTube has been a big support system for me. At the end of this video, I will explain more ways that I've got sober, stayed sober, and happily sober. Okay, let's get into it. Addiction, nature or nurture? All the greatest minds, psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists, pretty much all come to the same agreement that it's a combination, and it's on an individual basis. I mean, there are some people that in a family, only one person presents as having addiction issues. Was it nature? Was it nurture? If the other siblings didn't have addiction issues, was it the pecking order? That has a big effect on how we grew up. Is it that one child was born more sensitive than the other? Perhaps they all experienced a similar trauma, yet one child, being more sensitive, reacted more intensely. So I don't think it's necessarily the most important question to answer, nature or nurture, which aspect has a bigger effect. What we do know, and what I definitely know, is that I suffered with many addiction issues most of my life. Toxic families. I hesitated to talk about this in detail, and there will be many details I will leave out. But I will say that my mother was very abusive, emotionally and physically. I'm pretty much not in touch with many of my family, including my siblings, some of my cousins, because they were not supportive about me coming out about this. I don't know what happened to my mother. God bless her soul. May she rest in peace. Clearly had some major traumas herself for her to treat me, us, the way that she did. My mother quite likely suffered with narcissistic personality disorder. In many of my studies, she's pretty much a textbook case. Because I challenged my mother, even at a very young age, when she would tell me to do things, I would ask her why. That never went over well. I noticed that my siblings were more compliant. They aligned with my mother, but I would often question her decisions. She did not like that. So I ended up being the scapegoat in the family, or at least I was my mother's scapegoat. Let's put it that way. With my father, I was more of the golden child. So that helped me survive, because with my mother and my siblings, I often refer to my status in the family as Cinderella, even though my mother and my siblings were my biological family. I was often treated like Cinderella, really poorly. And I couldn't wait until my daddy came home at night because I was his golden child and all of the sins of the day were washed away when he came home. Now, I don't blame my mother, nor do I blame my siblings for how I was treated. At least I can say at this point in my life, I don't. There was a period where I was quite angry when I realized what had happened to me, but I'm not in that place anymore. Clearly, my mother had some very traumatic experiences herself. And gosh, if I was my siblings and I watched how my mother treated one of the siblings horribly, I wouldn't want to go against her either. So I do understand it. Now, scapegoats in the family are often the truth tellers. And I knew at a really, really young age that something was wrong with my mother. I remember when she would come at me with such rage, wielding a wooden spoon to come and beat me. I remember having these thoughts of, what is wrong with her? Maybe age 3, age 4. I remember thinking, what is wrong with her? And when I would go to a friend's house, one of my girlfriends who I would have play dates with, and I noticed how her mother would hug her and kiss her. And I had those thoughts, well, why doesn't my mother do that? So when my mother would present something that just seemed really off to me, it didn't seem fair, it didn't seem right, I would question it. I wouldn't yell at her or anything, but I would question it. But that would set her off and I would get a beating. And here's what happened when I reached about age 12 or 13. My sister was annoying me, and I called her a name, and she ran to my mother, and my mother screamed and yelled at me and told me to come into the kitchen. I don't know what happened on this particular day. Why did it happen then? But it did. She raised her hand to hit me, and I just grabbed it. Now, I wasn't quite her height, but I was taller by then. And I looked in her eyes and I said, "What are you going to do? Hit me?" "I don't think so." And my goodness, I watched my mother's face crumble. The fear that washed over her was intense. She never hit me again. Now, you're probably asking, where was my father in this entire dynamic? My father he left early in the morning before school started, and he often did not come home until after dinner and ate dinner after all of us finished our dinner. I do remember when I was quite young, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4, I had a bruise on my face. And I remember looking at it in the mirror and being so happy that I could actually show my dad that there was abuse. I mean, how do you explain as a kid, mommy hit me, but I actually had something to show and I was excited. Weird, strange. So I did share with him. First, I showed him the bruise when he got home, and and then he asked what happened, and I said, "Mommy hit me." Oof, that was really scary because I heard him yelling at her. I was in another room, and he just screamed at her and said, "If you have to hit them, don't ever hit them on the face, hit them on their bottoms." And I guess that's what went on. And she surely did hit me several times, and I'm sure my siblings too, quite viciously. I think what happened with me was that I was afraid. I remember being afraid for my mother. I didn't want her to be kicked out of the house. I wanted her to be accountable for what she did, but I didn't want her being kicked out of the house, and I was afraid. So I never mentioned any of the beatings ever again. Also, back in the 60s, it was quite common for parents to discipline their children with spankings. It has more recently been proven to be extremely detrimental, but back then it was commonplace. So with my father, I was his golden child. It was a very strange dynamic to be the scapegoat with my mother and my siblings, and then to be my father's golden child. And I've often wondered if My mother, having narcissistic personality disorder, most likely was jealous of my father's attention on me because I was the first girl. It was my brother, then me, then my younger sister. And my mother would always, when we were in public, hug my brother and say, "My son, my son, my son." So a narcissist would not feel in competition with a son, but, a cute little girl that daddy is adoring could have had an influence on her being jealous of me. I mean, I've only learned this through lots of therapy. Of course, humming through the world, not knowing anything about scapegoats and golden children or lost children, all I knew was my life was elevated as soon as my father came home. And he supported all my ventures, my sports. He was incredibly supportive. I mean, here's a man who worked, 2 to 3 jobs at a time often. I grew up in a blue-collar family. My dad never complained, but he worked often. And he would find the time to go to my sporting events, which was wonderful. So I had this great support on one side, and then I would be torn down on the other side. Now, here's where this story takes a nosedive. In my senior year of high school, my second boyfriend in high school was my senior year. He was Black. And that did not go over well with my father in any way, shape, or form. At one point, he threatened to kick me out of the house. I decided to do him one better, and I ran away before that could happen. That did get resolved. He did finally let me back in the house. However, our relationship was strained for many years. I stayed with this guy for 2.5, maybe even 3 years before I started modeling. And modeling is when my severe sexual traumas began. I moved to New York City. I was raped by a photographer there. Years later, I was raped by him again. I told no one. And then in Paris, I moved to Paris maybe just a few months after New York because my modeling agent said it was easier to start in Europe. I escaped rape, 2 men on the street. Thank God for my athletic prowess because I outran them both. I'm not going into the details about it. It was horrific. But I also escaped sex trafficking in Morocco. So these sexual traumas had a very big effect on me. Now, if I was closer with my mother, maybe she would have guided me better to stay away from certain situations. So my mother never spoke to me about sex. She never spoke to me about protecting myself from sexual attacks, being careful, being around older men. I mean, there was just never a discussion, ever, ever, ever. And that could have contributed to these sexual traumas. Whatever is the case, they did happen to me. I buried them. And ultimately, I discovered many years later, this had much to do with my sex addiction. Many people like myself who had toxic family systems ended up having addiction issues. Not all people do, but I did. And many people that I know, especially through the 12-step programs, they share often about the challenging family situation that they grew up with. Now, if you stay blaming your family your entire life, that's not going to help you. It happened. It happened. Now, some people say just get over it, but healing is necessary. And I did a ginormous amount of healing. It started in my early to mid 20s. And what precipitated me entering therapy was I told American Vogue to basically go piss off because I was so pissed off. I realized at that moment, and of course they never used me again, I realized at that moment that I had a really big problem with anger and I did not know what to do with it. So I did start therapy. And I have pretty much been in therapy ever since. I go for a year or two maybe without therapy, but by and large, it's my stable support system, as well as YouTube. as well as the 12-step programs. And I have done specific healing work, some deep trauma work. It is crucial to heal. Otherwise, we walk around as a ball of fear, resentments, anger, which resentments are anger, and it's not a way to live. So, if you have any specific questions regarding my history of healing, please feel free to reach out to me at any time. I will give you all my best information. As Bill Wilson, who wrote the very famous book on alcoholism back in the 30s, he said that an alcoholic doesn't trust anyone except for another alcoholic, because only that person truly understands the pain that they are going through. And so that's where I come from, as someone who has suffered for decades with addiction issues. And I also have decades of sobriety and health. So welcome back to the Sober Sofa, and I look forward to seeing you again and again. Please hit the subscribe button, the bell notification, thumbs up to my videos, and I look forward to seeing you back here next week at the Sober Sofa.